Hey, welcome to the broadcast. My name is John Mayfield, the real estate tech guy, and thank you for joining me on a Monday night here in November, where we will talk about the ADA, the American Disabilities Act. So, appreciate you joining. I'm going to go over just some key points regarding ADA and also have a couple of exam questions that I'd like to go over. We'll go over to the board occasionally, but really want you to be able to understand what is part of the ADA, American with Disabilities Act, and really specifically questions you might see or topics you might see on your real estate examination. So let's get right into today's broadcast, and let me go over to the board and we'll take a look at the ADA. So I have some notes on the board and I thought we would go over these. I'm going to go over here. So what is the purpose and the scope of the ADA? And again, this ADA stands for the American with Disabilities Act. So I want you to understand that this is really focusing on those individuals who have disabilities and what would be some of their rights to have equal access. And so we've got a couple of key things right here. And one of the things you need to always understand with the ADA, I'm going to just go over here to my highlighter, is that we're talking about public spaces, okay? And so how can people with disabilities have equal access to public spaces? And so this includes transportation and other areas of daily life. So in real estate, this really affects, and I want us to kind of look at this specifically commercial spaces. I think that's something that's very important for you to write down and understand. Sometimes residential properties with, and this is the key here, that would have public areas like leasing offices, or might even be something that if you were in a planned unit development where there was a swimming pool or some other facilities that encompass those public areas of the subdivision, those would be applicable to ADA. But normally we're talking about commercial spaces. So you really need to understand. I'm just going to come back over here, but I forgot that I have the iPhone here. So hopefully, let's see if that will bring me up. There we go. So normally we're talking about commercial spaces. So I want you to read the questions very cautiously and carefully to understand, does this question pertain to a residential property? Because ADA probably will not apply unless it was a leasing office, or possibly, as I mentioned, with a planned unit development or some type of subdivision created by the developer where there were common elements others owned. ADA may apply in that residential situation, but normally we're talking about commercial property. So I think this is a real key here that you have to remember and understand, is the commercial properties. Now, understanding ADA obligations is critical, especially when we're advising clients on property compliance. Remember, the ADA ensures accessibility, so knowing what it applies to is key for the examination. Now, the second area I want to talk about with ADA is this public accommodations, because we talked about that briefly on the last point, but let's kind of dive into this a little bit more. And so I'm going to come back over here to the highlighter because I think that always does a good job. But let's take a look here. ADA compliance is required for businesses and buildings open to the what? To the public. For example, real estate office, a retail space, or doctor's office, all of these would fall under this category and must be accessible to people with disabilities. So while private residential spaces aren't covered by the ADA, public facilities within residential complexes, such as a leasing office, we talked about that, a community gym or a community swimming pool, those would be covered. And so again, the key to really answering these ADA questions on your examination is to ask yourself, is this a public area if it's involved with some type of residential dwelling or complex? If not, ADA doesn't apply to just a residential home. ADA does not apply to your residential home, but ADA could apply to your real estate office that you work for or any other commercial business that has this public area here that's open to the public. So don't forget that. Very, very important. Number 3, I think this is something that you need to know. Reasonable accommodations versus modifications. Okay? So there is an important difference here. There's an important difference between reasonable accommodations and modifications. So a reasonable accommodation refers to changes in policies or practice. For instance, allowing a service animal in a no-pet apartment complex. That would be a reasonable accommodation, okay? Modifications, on the other hand, are physical changes to the property, like installing ramps or grab bars in a bathroom. So on the exam, you need to be able to differentiate between these terms and understand when each is required, particularly in rental properties. So again, let's think about this. A reasonable accommodation is me allowing you to have a service animal in your apartment, which is strictly no pets allowed. I have to make that's a reasonable accommodation. A modification is when I'm going to allow you to take the carpets up off the floor so you can move your wheelchair around. Or I'm going to allow you to install grab bars in the bathroom. That's a reasonable modification. And when you read these questions, I think it's going to be very evident for you to be able to determine, is this a reasonable request or not? Very important for you to really, again, dive into the questions and understand and be able to answer those. Now, this leads us to number 4, okay, where we talk about undue burden. So we have undue burden and readily achievable standards. So let's discuss the terms undue burden and readily achievable, okay? So the ADA requires accessibility changes that are readily achievable, meaning, take a good note of this, they're easily doable without significant difficulties or expense. Well, if I allowed you to put grab bars or I needed to install grab bars in the bathroom, that's not a huge expense, right? There was a question that was seen in the past about what would someone not be required to put back to normal, and if they had a disability and they wanted to make some reasonable modifications to the apartment. And there were things like grab bars and carpeting, and they removed the carpeting and some different things. They would have to put those back the way they found it. But there was the answers that all of them would have to be replaced, except, and the exception was they wouldn't have to put the doorways back to the normal door size. So in other words, I have a door right over here that's a normal doorway. Well, if you wanted to make that doorway wider so you could get your wheelchair in, I couldn't make you put the door back to the original size. So again, you have to really read these questions, but is it an unburdened or readily achievable? And you can see in this, it's easy. What is readily achievable are those things that are easily doable without significant difficulty or expense. However, we have this right here, don't we? If a property owner can show that a change imposes an undue burden, like a major financial or structural hardship, they may not be required to make that change. Well, here's a good example. My wife and I owned a 4-family apartment dwelling. It was 2 stories, and there were stairs to get up to the 2nd floor. Now, if we had someone who came and wanted to rent that apartment building and they were in a wheelchair, they couldn't demand that we put in an elevator. There's only 2 units upstairs and 2 downstairs. That requirement, or request, I should say, to put in an elevator in an older building that only had 2 units on the top floor would definitely be a hardship to my wife and I. And so something like that would not fall under this. Excuse me. So for the exam, you might be asked to identify an example of a readily achievable modification, or to recognize when an undue burden might apply. So just ask yourself, don't freak out about this. Is this would this be a burden on the owner to have to do this? Now, carpeting, if you're in a wheelchair and I don't want carpeting on the floors, I really want to have, we had 2 of those units were on the basement floor and they had concrete. If they wanted to say, we want to remove the carpet so we can easily get around in our wheelchair, that's not something that I could deny them to do, okay? However, the tenant would have to put the carpet back in the way they found it. So we'd have to store that, or they would have to make arrangements to store that and have the carpet put back down. But I couldn't stop them from doing that. Now, they couldn't require me to put an elevator in the property. So, you just have to look at the question, ask yourself, is this something that's really an undue burden on the owner, or is this readily achievable and something that could be done without a lot of problems? So let's take a look at requirements. I should have put that up there for new construction versus existing buildings. And this is what you may very well see on the test with ADA. ADA requirements differ for new constructions versus older buildings. New buildings, particularly those, and I take a note of this, constructed after 1992, this is key here, you could very well see that on the test, are required to meet full ADA compliance standards. So, make sure, whoops, I want to go back there. Make sure that you ask yourself, when was the building constructed? Because anything after 1992 is required to meet full ADA compliance standards. All right? That could very well be an exam question. Older buildings, in other words, those that are less than 1992, only need to implement changes if they're readily achievable. So, what do we mean by readily achievable? Okay, well, here we go. Let's take a look at this because we've got some key things here that we can highlight and understand. Readily achievable under the ADA means that an adjustment or modification is what? Easily accomplishable and able to be carried out without much difficulty or expense. Now, again, this is only applying to existing buildings before 1992, and businesses and property owners are required to make changes to improve accessibility only if the modifications are affordable and feasible. For example, adding grab bars in bathrooms. That's not that difficult. Installing a ramp over small steps. Not that difficult. Rearranging furniture or display racks to clear pathways. Lowering a countertop for better access. All of these things would be what? They would be easily or readily achievable. Those modifications would not be that difficult. So, when we talk about properties, and I'll go back to the previous session here, when we talk about these properties that were built prior to 1992, if it's something that you can easily fix, readily achievable might be the word they use, and you should be able to pick these out, then yeah, you're going to probably need to make those modifications. But again, I want you to understand it needs to be readily achievable. All right? So a lot of your ADA questions really are going to come down to you making a judgment call. Is this going to be a financial burden on the property owner, or is this something that can be easily done without too much effort? Now, don't try to draw too much into the questions, but just ask yourself those questions, and I think you'll make a good judgment call. Now, don't forget, 1992 forward, if it's new construction, needs to conform to ADA requirements, okay? Now, in my community, somebody just built a 3-story complex. I think, and I'd have to look this up for ADA because I don't know. Maybe we can do that shortly. They do not have elevators over there. I thought 3 stories you had to have an elevator, but maybe it's 4. We'll take a look at that when we come back here in a moment. But understand these situations, and I think you'll be able to answer the questions fine. So let's look at accessible routes and common features. ADA compliant features, I'm going to go back to the highlighter right here. Buildings have specific features to help people with disabilities access the space safely and easily. This includes things like ramps, accessible parking spaces, appropriate signage, and doors that are wide enough for wheelchairs. These features are especially important in public areas with buildings. I think that's a really key point right there that I would remember. So, common accessibility features with ADA compliance. Questions may ask you to identify which features are required by the ADA, and we just talked about some of those right above. One more of these, I think 7. We might have one more after this. And then I've got a couple of questions I want us to go over. But this is on service animals and assistance animals. You could very well see a question trying to ask you or differentiate between the two. So an interesting ADA detail relates to service animals. Under the ADA, a service animal, and I would highlight this and make a note, are defined as dogs, okay? Make that note. They're defined as dogs trained to perform tasks for a person within a disability. It's not a monkey. It's not a squirrel. I know I've seen things about squirrels on X lately. Not any of that, okay? It is a dog that's trained to perform tasks for a person with a disability. So that is a service animal. Service animals must be permitted in public spaces. So there's a couple of things right here I would definitely make a note of. And I'm just going to come back here. So we've got this, right? Dogs, they're trained to perform tasks for a person with a disability. They must be permitted in public spaces. Now, let's take a look at this right here because it's totally different. An emotional support animal. Normally, Lucy comes down here and hangs out with me, my little Frenchie. She normally is over there snoring, and I'm going to put up a Lucy cam so I can press a button and we can go over to the Lucy cam. But it's 7 o'clock at night, and she's upstairs, not really wanting to come down here with me. But I'd love to take Lucy with me on some of my trips because she, first of all, she hates it when I travel. And she loves, she does not like for me to go anywhere. And I love to have her along with me. And I'm seeing a lot of people with these support animals on airplanes. Now, I probably couldn't go that far. I mean, she would be support for me, but she wouldn't really be a support animal, okay? However, I want you to understand there is a difference between a service animal and an emotional support animal, okay? So an emotional support animal or other types of assistance animals are not covered under ADA. You need to make a note of that. What is covered under ADA? Right here. Dogs trained to perform tasks for a person with a disability. A cat, it's an emotional cat, is not covered under ADA. Okay, it's not. Make sure I use the word aren't there, but they're not covered. And again, we're talking about emotional support. So this is a common point of confusion and one that you will not miss on the exam because you're going to say, John taught me this. And I understand that, there are some ADA protections for folks with disabilities, but emotional support animals do not fall underneath that, okay? So be clear on the exam. Are we talking about a service animal? Or are we talking about an emotional support animal? Because there is a very big difference there, and you'll need to know that for the exam. So number 8, and this is the last one, and then we're going to cover a couple of quick questions. Fair Housing Act versus ADA. We need to understand the relationship between the ADA and the Fair Housing Act, or FHA. Both laws aim to prevent discrimination, but they apply differently. The Fair Housing Act covers accessibility in residential areas, ensuring that individuals with disabilities have equal housing opportunities. Okay? The ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, on the other hand, applies to what? Public areas like a leasing office or a clubhouse in an apartment complex. So if there's a question on the exam that asks about a leasing office's accessibility, ADA would apply. For a residential unit modifications, that falls under the Fair Housing Act. Okay? So the Fair Housing Act covers a lot of different things that we cover in fair housing. And by the way, I plan to be doing live streaming every night at 7 p.m. this week. On Thursday night, I may be doing a career night, okay? But I'll try to throw in some preparation for you. And if you want to know more about your career you're going for in real estate, well, we'll talk about that as well. But the Fair Housing Act, when we talk about disabilities, is that I can't discriminate against you if you have a disability. And we'll cover those as we move through this section this week, so be sure and watch. But ADA is really covering commercial buildings and public spaces in residential apartment complexes, where ADA says, look, you've got to have accommodations available for those folks with disabilities, especially in the public areas. Okay, parking spaces. We talked about lowering countertops, grab bars, some of those things, wider doorways. Usually ADA units need to be available on the first floor and so forth. So just understand there is a difference between fair housing, the Fair Housing Act, and ADA. Okay, and then penalties for non-compliance. I was wrong. We do have one more. They're going to lead to fines, lawsuits, reputation. I think that's all pretty self-explanatory. Well, let's look at a couple of questions here. And which of the following properties is required to comply with ADA guidelines? Would it be a single-family home in a private neighborhood? Couple of key points there. Again, which of the following is required? Would it be an office building leased to multiple businesses? Would it be a privately owned vacation cabin? Or a rental apartment unit in a duplex? Well, the correct answer is B. This one right here. It's an office building leased to multiple businesses. Remember, commercial is the key here. And the ADA applies to public accommodations and commercial spaces. So an office building with public access would need to comply with ADA guidelines. The other items are all residential. And again, a rental apartment unit in a duplex would fall under, and that's a good distractor there, but this would fall under FHA, the Fair Housing Act. The question was asking us about ADA, okay? And that you've got to connect the commercial part to this question. Good job. I know a lot of you got that correct, so great job. A tenant in an apartment complex, okay, so we know it is an apartment complex, requests that grab bars be installed in their bathroom to assist with mobility. This type of request is known as, well, is this a reasonable accommodation? A structural modification? Would this be an undue burden on the owner to have to put grab bars up? I don't think so. We could mark that one off, couldn't we? Would this be a reasonable modification? So the key really gets down to, is this a reasonable accommodation or a modification? Well, I think the answer would be a reasonable modification. And as you can see, that is the correct answer. So notice how we had a question, a couple of good distractors there, but this is not an accommodation. This is just a modification to that property. Okay, the last question. Under ADA guidelines, which of the following animals would be considered a service animal permitted in public spaces? Well, would it be a trained service dog? I didn't know that would happen. Apple came out with a new update, and I tell you what, I keep hovering my mouse over and everything just explodes. Well, there's a key word there called a dog. And remember, I told you a dog falls under the ADA guidelines. So, assist with mobility tasks. I like that one, but we're going to put a question mark. An emotional support cat. Remember, I told you those don't fall under ADA, only the dog. A miniature horse used for companionship. Sorry, that would be an emotional support dog. That doesn't fall under ADA. Or a pet rabbit. Look at the distractor. Trained to follow commands. But the key is, because you've been going through John's digital flashcards at Global Real Estate School, rabbit doesn't fall under there. The key is a dog. So the correct answer is a trained service dog that assists with mobility tasks. So good job on those questions. I will come back over here to my desk and sit down and kind of wrap up our session with you. This, believe it or not, was one little bullet point from the candidate handbook over ADA. And you could see some questions, or a question could be the difference between passing or failing the exam, right? One question. Although if you're going to Global Real Estate School, we're going to help you pass with more questions. You know, it's been frustrating for me as a school owner because I provide lots of resources and materials. I'm going to take a quick drink of water. And don't leave just yet, because I want to talk to you here. I got some great advice to pass the exam. And we're going to find out, too, how many stories does a building need to have for requirement of an elevator under ADA. Let's see what we can find out. I'm asking ChatGPT to help me out there. 3 stories or fewer, or have less than 3,000 square feet per floor. Interesting. I should have put that in there. So 3,000 square feet or fewer, 3 stories or fewer, or less than 3,000 square feet per floor are generally not required. So you would have to have 4 floors. So I guess the apartments in my area are safe, okay? So that's good to know. So 4 floors or more, they need an elevator. That could be a test question. 3 stories or 3,000 square feet or less per floor, you don't need an elevator. Okay. I think they would probably go on 4 stories, needs an elevator, 3 or fewer does not. So what I wanted to mention to you before we wrap up here is I've been just kind of discouraged because some of the pass rates haven't been where we'd like for them to be. And not just my school, many schools. This last month, it really was much better. But I want 100%. I don't want 60 or 62 or 58 or 70. I want 100% pass rate. What's interesting, and I mentioned this before, students who follow my recipe pass the test. The students who try to deviate, rush through, I'm going to cram, I'll do this, I'll learn it at the end, they don't pass. So I'm learning this in my own life as a marketer for my online school. I see these folks that are very successful and they say, here's the recipe, John. Here's the recipe. Follow it. And I'm like, oh, it needs a little more salt. Or, let's throw some more pepper in there. I don't want to put onions. I want to put carrots. And anyway, follow the recipe and you'll pass the test. So we've got some great tools at Global Real Estate School. I've got digital flashcards, practice exams. I have some great audios you can listen to in your car, driving back and forth where I go over the material. And, oh, by the way, I have lots of short videos and a whole program called My Real Estate Exam Coach. And finally, this is why I want you to stay. I need to go over to the board because I have this right here. Help me pass the realestateexam.com. Some free, recently seen exam questions. So go there and download those. There's some great questions. I give you audio feedback, and I'm going to be adding some more questions to those. And if you're thinking about getting your real estate license, we'd love to have you at globalrealestateschool.com. Check us out. We've got lots of resources there. I can even help you after you get your license. We've got some online coaching to help you sell property because, hey, that's what it's all about. My goal is not only to help my students pass the real estate exam, but I want to help you be a real estate rock star. So I've got some great coaching there, lots of resources. globalrealestateschool.com. Hey, as always, thank you for watching, and I hope you go out and make it a great day. Thank you for listening to the podcast for Global Real Estate School. I'm John Mayfield, the Real Estate Tech Guy. Go out and make it a great day.